Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Welcome to Unless, the podcast, inspired by that Dr. Seuss quote from the Lorax that reminds us of the role we can each play in making the world a better place. Join Dr. Hemma and her guests as they share incredible stories of being moved to decisive action and perseverance, leading to tangible impact at scale. This podcast is a production of Corporate Compliance Insights.
Well, I think one of the big ahas early on in the lab was that we tend to be blind to the goodness in the world. Okay, so people will say we have heightened threat detection because we have to know when the bear is going to come and eat us, right?
Right.
Or when a predator is going to come and chase us down. So we have the fight, flight, freeze. We're very hyper vigilant toward any kind of threat, perceived or real, right? But we are not hyper vigilant to the good because that doesn't require a response from us. It doesn't require kinetic action from us. If something good is happening in the world, it doesn't mean that we have to all of a sudden start running in the opposite direction, right? If something good is happening in the world, we're just chill. We're just sitting there, eating our berries, talking to our friends, braiding hair, doing whatever it is that Paleolithic people did. It doesn't require anything from us. So we are blind, utterly blind to all the goodness, all the kindness, all the positive acts in the world. We take them for granted. And because we're blind to it, we think that it doesn't exist.
That's Margarita Quihuis, a social entrepreneur, strategist, innovator, and an authority in persuasive technology, behavior design, and peace technology. I am Dr. Hemma. Welcome to Unless the podcast. Named one of the 100 most influential Latinos in Silicon Valley, Margarita Quihuis is the Executive Director of the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford University and the former Director of the Peace Innovation Institute at The Hague. She is also currently Director of Ecopreneurship for Stanford Alumni in Sustainability. Her career has been on the leading edge of new technology, digital transformation, human-centered design, access to capital, entrepreneurship, and research. As a research team member at BJ Fogg's Behavior Design Lab, she combines behavioral change, persuasive technology, and finance for real-world impact. At the Stanford Peace Innovation Lab, Margarita researches innovation, mass collaboration, and social technology to reform society. Margarita, welcome to Unless the podcast. I am so thrilled to have you join me here today.
Thank you so much for the privilege of talking about my work. I love to talk about my work. So let's do this.
Oh, I'm so grateful. And look, in the very short time that I've known you, I realize that I've merely scratched the surface of your achievements and your accolades in my introduction. I've already learned so much from you. Now, normally in my podcast, I'd like to kick off by having you share in your own words who you are and what you do, and we will get to that. But first, another thing I learned from you as part of your behavior design toolkit of sorts to achieve positive peace was this idea that we should start with the future in mind. So beautiful, so poetic. And I realized that you apply that in everyday situations. So we're going to do that today. We're going to start with the future in mind. We're going to fast forward to the day that this episode is published. And I'm going to ask you, what would your desired outcome of this podcast, this episode, be for our listeners?
Let me think. So my desired outcome for people who listen to this podcast is, one, that they get a reframe of what is possible to achieve in the world for themselves personally, in their family, in their community, and in society. Two, that they get some concrete tools that they can begin to apply Monday morning, immediately, so that way they can have more agency and become architects of the life and the community that they want to live in. And three, that they're able to share one or two ideas with others around them.
And this is really, thank you. This is why I wanted to do this podcast, to meet people like you that not only have these big ideas of what they can achieve in the world, but have really thought about how to operationalize that at scale. Because that's what we're looking for, isn't it? The secret sauce to operationalizing our good intentions. And, I see that in you, in the achievements I've known about. So I can't wait to share that with our listeners. Also, you may or not be aware that some of the questions I ask my guests tend to chase their hero's journey. But one thing you've taught me is to make sure we're looking for the heroine's journey. And that was so important for me to realize with you that I should be looking for the heroine's journey. We should be talking about the female gaze. And so I'm going to be taking you through the heroine's journey today and learning a little bit from you about what that means and how that's shown up in your life. So let's start with your heroine's journey, Margarita, if we may. What's your origin story in your ordinary world? What's your day job and what got you there?
Well, so, it's funny because my life has been very serendipitous, I would say. I'm Mexican American. My mother was from Mexico. My father was from Arizona, Yaqui, so indigenous. And he was a construction worker all his life. And my mother was a homemaker. She did not finish her high school education until she was middle-aged. So when she was a child, my grandmother had 5 daughters by the age of 32. And my grandfather was in the Bracero program in the United States. And this was a program that was initiated during World War II to bring farm workers into the United States because there was a labor shortage. And so he was doing that and basically going to the United States and then coming back, getting my grandmother pregnant, going to the United States and coming back, getting her pregnant again. And my grandmother said, this is, I need to be closer to him. So she sold everything they had in Zacatecas and moved to Tijuana, which is the city on the other side of the border from San Diego. And my mother was 12 at the time. So I thought that was pretty bold when I realized, oh my gosh, my grandmother was married at 17. She had these 5 girls, boom, 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 boom. She must have been in her early 30s. And the courage to say, and my grandmother was illiterate, mind you, to just take everything and move was pretty radical of her. And so my mother's education stopped after like middle school, junior high. And then she worked. She worked as a nurse. She had appendicitis, and the way that the family could repay the doctor was through labor. So my mother went to work for the doctor, trained to be a nurse, and then she met my father at 17. They got married when she was 19, and he immigrated her, and then there were subsequent daughters after that. My mother's one of 8 girls, a lot of estrogen in that family. And so they moved to the United States. So it was a very typical Mexican American story. And so we were the first generation to be born in the United States from my mother's side. On my father's side, they had been in Arizona forever. So for my dad's side, they didn't cross the border. The border crossed them, right? But for my mom, they were more in central Mexico. So it was pretty prosaic, and I grew up in a community that was primarily white. Its nickname was Clan T, after the Ku Klux Klan. So it was a bit racist, and we were one of the few Hispanic families in the community. But it was a pretty ordinary life in the United States in the 60s and 70s. And then I was very determined to leave and see the world. So I think my heroine's journey was more of this yearning to see what was beyond the world, the little bubble that I lived in. And my way out was education. And I had always been a bookworm and very smart and very, book smart, not necessarily socially smart. But that was enough to get me to Stanford. And that's really where my journey and my challenges began, because I moved from this very basic suburban working class community into this other class, this other milieu and culture. And that's when I became like this intense anthropologist, where I go, I have to really study these people in this culture to figure out how to fit in, because it's all new to me, coming in with a beginner's mind and saying, like, I have to navigate this, and I don't have anyone to help me.
Right. So curiosity seemed to be then the secret for you, the fascinated anthropology that comes from the need of wanting to fit in and the need to wanting to be part of a new community. I see that. And now you say you were lucky. I think we're going to find that luck follows you, but you also created your own luck. You were the first person in your family to go to college. Is that right?
Yes.
And then, and then the first person in your high school to graduate in 3 years. Is that correct?
Yes.
The first person to go to Stanford from your high school.
Yes.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the first female petroleum engineer to graduate from Stanford.
I was the first Hispanic female.
There we go. First Hispanic female. So that's a lot of firsts. I think that's the only thing. I think, again, you're the first female director of a renowned venture capital firm. We'll get to your career achievement. But what does it take to become the first in these places? I see that when you're there, the curiosity serves you, but the courage to become the first and to step into those roles. Tell us about that.
Well, you know what? It didn't feel courageous at the time. It was just when I was in high school, I just thought, how can I get out of here? What's the fastest way to get out of here? And I thought, like, can I get out of here in 2 years? And they said, like, no, you can't do it in 2 years. And I go, okay, 3? Yes, you can graduate in 3 years. I said, all right, let's do this. So it wasn't so much about being the first. Like, I didn't know that I was the first Hispanic female petroleum engineer out of Stanford. I didn't know that I was going to be the first of something. It wasn't like, I want to be the first this. It was circumstantial. It was more, I've always been very curious. I've always been attracted to new things or things that haven't been done before. I don't know why I have that attraction. I'm thinking back, what was I feeling like? I'm trying to channel my 17-year-old self. I've always been intellectually confident. Okay, I've always been confident about my brain, my ability to think, my ability to figure things out. To me, everything is figure outable. There's no topic that I think that I can't do. And I don't know if that's intellectual arrogance or overconfidence, but for the most part, if I set my mind to something, I can do it. And so I'm very disciplined of mind. And so I don't get intellectually intimidated by things. If someone says, oh, that's going to be a lot of work, I go, pisha, big deal. But that's also the Mexican in me, because Mexicans can grind. If you say, we got to move that mountain and all you have is a shovel, everyone goes, all right, turn the radio on and let's do it. Let's just start doing it. So hard work has never been something that intimidates me. I go, oh, well, then therefore it's impossible. I just go, okay, so how do we break this down? And I just work at it. So while everyone else is talking about how hard it's going to be and they got to have a plan and blah, 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 I'm halfway through because, like, just let's get started, right?
Yeah.
So that tends to be my attitude about things, that I can just power through things. And it hasn't really been about like, it's in retrospect, I will realize that I was the first, or I was very early in. So, I was born in 1961. So that meant that I was a child during the civil rights movement, but I got to kind of see some of that. The 70s were very interesting. And, I came up through disco and the Bee Gees, woohoo. But in 1979, it was, the end of that liberal era, and just before Reagan, that conservative era was coming in. And it was funny, as an undergraduate, we could feel that inflection point in my freshman class. We're going like, oh, we're the last liberal class.
Right.
Because we could see the younger people coming up, and they were temperamentally, they were more politically conservative. So I'm still in that radical 70s hippie guard, right? But then the personal computer revolution starts coming up, and we're in this place in Silicon Valley where Palo Alto was still crunchy. It hadn't gotten quite super upscale and swanky the way it is now. So you still had remnants of the Peninsula Free University and the Palo Alto Co-op and the people who were experimenting with computers at Xerox PARC. And no one had become a billionaire yet. There was no such thing as unicorns, but people who were just tinkering with technology and playing with it. So one of the people I met early on who became a dear, dear friend of mine, and we had breakfast, coffee every morning for like 10 years.
Wow.
Fritz Fisher became a mentor of mine, and he was an artist who was into artificial intelligence back in those years, right? And we would sit there and he'd say, here, I want you to work these math problems. And so I go, okay, I'm 22 years old working a math problem over coffee at Cafe Verona. And all the people who hung out there were these people who were dabbling. Well, they weren't dabbling. They weren't seriously working on AI and all these technologies, but it was still something very obscure. And those people were part of my social group. But I was like this young woman, right? Like 20, 22, 23, 24. And then you had these people who were like the elders of AI who had been doing pioneering work in the 60s and 70s. And I'm sitting there having coffee with them every morning.
I mean, that's
No.
incredible. It sounds like you managed to move yourself into a situation where you were surrounded by like-minded people, decisive actors with belief in themselves that they could solve some problems. Now, look, there's a lot of conversation around women in tech and how difficult it is for a woman to survive in that environment. Clearly, you had a very invested mentor, at least one, if not many. What's your experience as a woman in that period in Silicon Valley?
Well, it was mixed, to be honest. So, I had my friend called them the aldercocker because there were all these old guys and they just sit around and before there was Facebook, okay, there was this place in Palo Alto called Cafe Verona.
Ah.
And it was the social gathering place in Palo Alto for breakfast. And so you had the crowd at 7 a.m., the crowd at 8 a.m., the crowd at 9 a.m., right? And it would be people like Whit Diffie who did these amazing encryption algorithms back in the day. And these people who were very notable academically, but they weren't like money famous, right? But because of Stanford, or Bob Metcalf, who was the father of local area networks, he was the CEO of 3Com. He would be sitting over and having coffee like 3 tables away, and so would be there. And everyone just sort of minding their own business, drinking and reading the New York Times. And then there was this one guy there who'd gather everyone up, and he'd have 6 or 7 people around the table and say, oh, come, sit with me, and let's just talk. Right. And so he was sort of like holding court, right? And he would just bring interesting people in, and you would just gravitate, and he'd invite people over and we just have a conversation. And John McCarthy, who's one of the fathers of AI, I remember he came in and he brought in his Kyoto Award, right? So we could see it.
Amazing.
And we were just hanging out. And so my seminal experience of Silicon Valley were like that. And it was 99.9% men. Okay. And they were very, very supportive. Now, in my professional work, it was different. So I was working for a material science company, and my boss would not speak to me directly. Instead, he would point to me and have another and say, tell her XYZ, right? I spent a lot of time crying in the bathroom in that job because it was so hard to navigate. And I was one of the few technical women in the organization. And I was coming in because I knew about personal computers and I taught myself local area networks, and I was leading this digital transformation on computer-aided design. And when you're 23 and you're bright-eyed, you go like, yeah, we can do this. How hard can it be? And I kind of dragged them into it and said like, yes, we can do this. But I would say that I was socially oblivious, which helps some way. So I was a little bit socially tone deaf. I was so focused on being very excited about that technology and very much an enthusiast. I wasn't thinking about the politics. I wasn't thinking about men being jealous or their feelings being hurt. I was kind of blind to that, which I think in retrospect was an asset, because if I had been sensitive to that, I might have stopped. Right. I might have gone into full on people pleasing mode and, these people's feelings and this and that and the other. And I wouldn't have been so single minded. But at that age, I was very single minded. This is my mission. I'm going to get it done. Yay. And then kind of having a sense, maybe a little bit, that people resented that because they had wanted that job. Now, mind you, in those years, nobody had resumes for these jobs. So it was the very beginning of the computer revolution. Macintosh hadn't even come out yet. So who was going to have 10 years of experience doing this? Nobody. It would be like, do you have 3 months of experience of this? Do you have 4 weeks of experience of this? Because the technology was so new. So that was an interesting time to be in. And I have found that in my career over and over again, I'm in this space where like nobody has a deep resume on any of this. So for women, for anyone, the biggest opportunities are in these green fields. And if you look at the history of other industries, like for instance, in the movie industry, in the 1910s, in the silent era, in the 1920s, there were so many women directors, producers, writers, screenwriters, and so on, because it was a free-for-all. Again, nobody had 30 years experience in the film industry. And so it was filled with women creators. As the industry gets more established, you see women dropping out.
What's that about, Margarita? Have you figured out what's happening there?
It's money. Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, here's my theory.
Yeah.
And I've seen this, and okay. So If some of a occupation has money and status and prestige, money, status, and prestige, it will be dominated by white men. When that occupation begins to lose money, status, and prestige, it will be more diverse.
Interesting.
So if you say like, oh, wow, look at this field, it's more diverse, they go, yeah, and watch how the salaries go down.
Mm.
So teaching used to be a purview of men. We think about women have always been teachers, but there was a time when men dominated in the teaching field. As women enter that field, the salaries go down.
Right.
And then the opposite is true. If something is becoming more valuable, more prestigious, you will see a movement of white men going into that field, and then they'll gatekeep. I always look at men as sort of like the canary in the coal mine of a field losing prestige and money when they start leaving.
And that, that's worrying, because it's one thing if you were to say there's a beginning, the movie industry begins and then it, elevates and needs different skill set. But I think these things are constantly evolving, and clearly technology is not something that started in the 60s and 70s. It's continuing, and we're seeing massive growth even, as we speak. Inventions are coming across. So
when you look at the original computer programmers were women.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it was a low status job.
Right.
There's like, oh, you have to sit there and do math, the hidden figures. Who are the mathematicians in terms of doing the, this grunt work of everyday mathematics? Oh, we'll give it to the women.
Right.
Right. But as it gets elevated, then the women are cast out.
Now, I know you've been personally involved in ensuring that there is venture capital for female entrepreneurs. I know you don't focus just on females, but certainly you've got an eye to that as well.
Yes.
As you look about. So tell us a bit about your experience there. How have you been able to counter that phenomenon? If your theory is correct, how have you been able to counter it in your work as a director of a venture capital firm?
Well, well, one, we haven't succeeded. If you look at the statistics in terms of the amount of venture capital that's allocated to women and what it was in the 1990s when I was working intensely on this, and now, it's only changed very, very little, by a couple of percentage points. Now, what has changed is the size of the venture capital pie has increased substantially, right? So if you look at absolute dollars, women are getting more money, but as a percentage, it hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
And there continues to be a bias. There was a very, very strong bias when I was working on this in the 90s. I was on the board of an organization that was founded by some Stanford Business School alum women called the Forum for Women Entrepreneurs. And we were focused on creating a community to foster female entrepreneurship in technology. And we did that. And as long as we were non-threatening, it was fine. When I launched Astia, which was the first technology incubator for women, at the time it was called the Women's Technology Cluster, I remember sitting across the table from male venture capitalists who would be on the attack saying, why do women need an incubator just for them?
Mm.
Right? I remember this one guy, he was just like very aggressive about it. And I said, I think that we have really great deal flow. They happen to be women. I think they're great startups. They happen to be founded by women. And I had to, pull back on the women angle and really emphasize, look at the opportunity. There's lots and lots of data and lots of studies that have been done in terms of women CEOs, women-founded companies, tech and otherwise, just women-owned businesses in general in the United States, how they tend to be more profitable and more successful. You can look at Latina businesses, Black women-owned. It doesn't matter. They tend to, even with all that data, because men said, we respond to data and logic, you present the data and logic, and the bias is still there. So I don't know how to solve this. If I did, I'd be the queen of the world. But I do know that arguing facts and figures is not persuasive enough.
Mm-hmm. And there's something underlying that story you told, that experience, where we tend to, as women, gravitate towards our masculine energy in order to have those conversations, in order to be in that room or at that table. You convert to the, assuming we both have masculine and female energy, we lean in and rely on that to mirror what we're seeing. So is that true for you? Did you end up doing that in some ways, bringing to the forefront your masculine energy as you operated in this environment, or is that not the case?
I am a very feminine woman, and I always have been. It's funny. I'm either a very intellectual person, so there's not any masculine or feminine. I'm just like brain on a stick, right? But how I present physically is very feminine. And for me, I've always been looking, how do I thread the needle of being an intellect and feminine? I don't think being feminine is a liability. When I was coming up, there were so many women who sat in their masculine in terms of how they spoke, how they presented, what their interests were, and so on. They really negated the feminine because they saw it as a liability, as something to be ashamed of. And I never did. I makeup, earrings, dresses. That's just who I am. Also, very Latina. Latina women are very feminine. We present very feminine because in our culture that's valued. That's not something to be ashamed of. And the feminine in Hispanic culture is seen as very powerful.
Right.
And I remember this one time, Fritz came back to me and he said, I saw the most amazing lecture, physics lecture at Stanford. And he goes, and you're going to love her. It was a female physicist, and she was wearing a red suit. You know, she showed up feminine.
Right.
Instead of showing up as a tomboy. And when I was working with the women venture capitalists in the 90s and the early 2000s, I said, okay, we're going to do this technology incubator for women, or we're going to do that. They would back away because they were so afraid to be associated with something that had the word women in it. Whereas the men where I did find allies were in the men who weren't afraid of that.
Right.
But the women felt like they couldn't expend that political capital to be associated with women's issues at that point in their career because they would be the only woman VC in the fund. And also in those years, I did a lot of data gathering on this stuff because I'd be looking at the website and saying, okay, I see, 5 guys in khaki pants and blue shirts, and then the one woman, right? Mm-hmm. And she'd have the title of managing director, but she would be the CFO. She wasn't actually an investing managing partner, right? So I kept track of all those things, and I actually had a networking group for a little bit, saying like, I'm just going to invite all the women in venture capital, and we have lunch once a month. And it was interesting because the senior women would not come, but the junior women would. And again, because they didn't want to they felt uncomfortable with that, of being allies with other women back then. That was 25 years ago. That things have changed quite a bit since then. There's a lot more diversity in venture capital. The Kauffman Foundation in the United States has done quite a bit. In the 90s, if you saw any diversity in venture funds, is because they were Kauffman Fellows.
Interesting.
And the way Kauffman Fellows worked was that they basically said to venture funds, we're going to bring you a person, either a woman or a person of color, into your organization, and we will pay their salary. And in which case they go, oh, okay, all right, we can accept that. And so the first generation of women and people of color, actually mostly women, honestly, were Kauffman Fellows. That's how they got into the industry.
Well, that's brilliant. I'll be looking that up. Look, those seeds, you're right, we haven't succeeded yet, but there are seeds of progress here. We hope that things are changing. But, I don't sit in judgment of any woman that's brought her masculine energy to work. I'm probably one of them. Again, that's not being masculine, but bringing the masculine energy to work. Look, many of us will rely on that and say that's the secret to our success. But I'm curious as to what might be missing if we don't balance it out and keep both. And if we hide half of our identity, at what cost? So I know that the female gaze is something you and I have talked about, and I want to talk about it in the context of your work, your peace innovation, of course. But let me just ask as a baseline question, what is the benefit of the female gaze in business?
Well, one, I think you need to be authentic, right? And so here's the thing. You're a woman and you're trying to pass for a man.
That's it.
Right? And people would look at you and say, like, you know what? You're a woman. And so you're kidding yourself if you think you can masquerade as a man and that you will be accepted as a man, because you won't. And I found that if I did that, I was betraying myself. And I'm not interested in betraying myself anymore. I'm not interested in betraying who I am, the community that I represent, by trying to pass when I'm not fooling anyone, right? What's more important and what is the political statement is the fact that I am in the room. The fact that I am in the room as a woman, as a Latina, as an Indigenous person, that is a political act.
Right.
Right. And so then the next step, when you have your courage, is to speak your truth. And speaking your truth isn't putting someone else down or say, like, oh, you pointing the finger, but just saying, like, this is what I see. And stating it in when you do it from stepping into your power of this is what I see. And people might argue the point with you and you say, that's fine. I understand that you don't see it that way. But from my point of view, this is what the world looks like. Do with it what you will, right? In our lab with my co-director, Mark, he often says, I'm the left eye and you're the right eye. And I've actually, when we're talking about allies and mentors, he's been a wonderful ally in helping my personal growth in this because he's very comfortable with the feminine. He goes, no, I have you here because I need to hear the perspective of the feminine. I represent the masculine. I don't need more masculine representation. I need to see both. And because at first I would say, like, okay, what does he want to hear? Right.
Right.
And then he said, look, no, don't tell me what I want to hear.
Yes.
That's not what I asked you. What do you see? Because he's good, like, between the two of us, we have stereoscopic vision. But if you're just telling me more left eye, I'm going to get blindsided.
Right.
And so we use this metaphor quite a bit now in our work and how we interact with other people. And we say, look, the telescope and the microscope do not argue about what they see. The telescope says, this is what I see at 20,000 feet, out in space, or the satellite, this is what I see, and this is the resolution. And the microscope grows great. You can only, you can get to like 10 feet above the ground, but I can get down to a microscopic view. And they're both true. They're both correct. And so what is it that you're examining and to what depth do you need to see it? And that's really what it's about. And so we talk a lot, and there's a military term called common operating picture. And so I'm always interested in getting the common operating picture. So in the fog of war, generals, they want to say, okay, I need all the inputs.
Yeah.
And then we're all going to look at this picture and say, okay, do we agree that this represents the reality of what's happening right now?
Right.
And this is our reference point. This is our common operating picture. And so I'm always looking to get the common operating picture. What is it that we're dealing with exactly? Tell me the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. I'm not going to flinch from it. And I need to have your perspectives. We can get this privilege blindness or this man blindness. And I sometimes tease my Mark or my son, and I'll say, like, can you get something out of the refrigerator? They go, I don't see it. I go, the tomato. It's there in the drawer. Where? I go, in the drawer. Where?
It's right in front of them.
Drawer, here. And they go, oh, there. And it's like, because they have this blindness. But I realized
you really didn't see it. Yeah.
They literally didn't see it. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's female. She goes, well, I don't know if it's man blindness, but it might be privilege blindness. It might be that you don't have to have a filter for that because it's not salient for you. So I had an experience recently where I twisted my ankle in New York, and I was going to the airport, and I go, I don't think I can walk the miles in JFK. So I go, okay, wheelchair. I'm going to be one of those people in a wheelchair, right? Get moved around. And that was an eye-opening experience because all of a sudden I had the gaze, the point of view of someone who is disabled.
That's right.
Right. And navigating through the airport and saying, like, oh, that's kind of bumpy. Oh, this airport wasn't built for someone like me. Right. In this disabled state who can't walk, I have to navigate with the wheelchair and someone pushing me around. And then even the way people treated me, because other people literally didn't see you, right? They kind of bump into you, they bang into your wheelchair, and you go, like, excuse me, I'm here, right? But they're blind to you. And that was from a design thinking standpoint, one of those empathetic experiences. And then I had to get, helped onto the plane, and so wheeled on. And the attendant was so resentful from Delta. She was complaining the entire time of why she had to do this. And I wanted to look at her and go like, I can hear everything you're saying.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But if I hadn't had that first person experience, I would not have known. I would not have the filter to see that and notice that. And so now I have a bit of an afterglow, as it were, of noticing accessibility.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it was salient to me. It's like, oh, okay, if I had to navigate this and I had some disability, this would be very difficult, if not impossible.
Right.
Right. And so these spaces were not designed for someone like me, because the person who designed it has never had this embodied experience.
Yeah, so true, Margarita. Gosh, there's so many good things you said there. I just want to recap a little bit. So I'm hearing, firstly, there's an integrity about this, like bringing your whole authentic self into the room, because that's power in itself. There's no point getting a door open to you and a table and a chair brought up to you if you've left half of yourself at the door. So that's number one. And I love that yin and yang of the left and right eye, or the male and female gaze. We have it in us ourselves. So whether it's a man and a woman working together, or one person bringing both their male and female perspectives, I see that as an integrity. And then to your point, then what we don't want to do is put on blinkers, right? To leave half of that away or dismiss half of that, whether it's for fear or assumptions we've made based on our experiences that we're not welcome, the female gaze is not welcome. I'm also hearing that if we do lean into that, we're going to see more, right? To your point, we're going to get fully informed choices, or a full picture of the battlefield, to your point, with your metaphor, which I thought was so beautiful. Now, the other piece I picked up from what you said is this collaboration idea, right? If you get these different gazes, you're much more informed and probably better equipped to solve a problem. This brings me to the other piece that I think is magnificent of what you do, but your work is this idea of peace innovation and positive peace. And I think, again, I'd like you to say it in your words, but there is something about peace innovation, which is about collaboration and having these different vistas. So let me ask you first, what is peace innovation?
Oh my gosh. Let's see. So peace innovation, the idea behind it came from BJ Fogg at Stanford in 2007. And he had just taught his course on Facebook. And so for listeners, if you Google Facebook class of 2007, you will find a New York Times article about it. And I remember when this course was happening, because it was a bit of a phenomenon on campus. BJ Fogg and Dave McClure, who's a venture capitalist, actually Dave was kind of in between things before he had become a VC. And I knew him because he used to hang out in the building that I was in at Stanford. They decided to teach a course at Stanford, a 10-week course, because Facebook had just opened up its platform to third-party developers, right? And for listeners who were just children at the time, Facebook was very different back then. It was closed. You needed to have a university email, so it tended to be young people. Then around 2005, 2006, they opened it up to other people, to like the general public. But it was still very static. You didn't have the news feed, and those innovations hadn't been developed yet. But you could install little apps, right? And so people said, okay, how can we experiment with this? 2007 was also the year the iPhone came out. Okay, so it was a really interesting watershed year in terms of technology inflection point. You have the iPhone, Facebook opens up its platform, and all of a sudden we have all these analytics tools, Google Analytics, Facebook Analytics, all that. And so for the first time, we can see how people use technology in great detail. All right. So if we dialed back the clock to 1997 and you were Microsoft and you sold Office, you sold it in a big box with all these CDs and manuals. They installed it and you had no idea how people used the product, which features they used, which features they ignored, how many hours they spent writing a document in Word. There was no visibility at all. It was a black box. I sold it to you, off you go, whatever. 2007, all of a sudden we can say, oh, I know how many people have hit my website page, how many minutes they've been there, did they go to different links, et cetera, et cetera. So we're beginning to see some behavior data, right? Facebook, you now have a social graph, which we didn't have. So a web page is like an individual pings. And, I remember looking at Google and it was like, oh, look, someone from Buenos Aires hit my website. And they were there for 0.2 seconds because they didn't mean to come to my website. Bing, and they're gone. So They have these kids go like, we have no idea what to do because this is a new capability. You guys figure it out. So these students start writing these tiny apps that they're going like, what can you do? You can't do something really sophisticated. You can do only something very simple. Same thing with the iPhone. People are looking at these apps and going like, what do I do with this iPhone? And so there's a lot of experimentation writing these very tiny, precise apps. So things like, I'm going to do a poke. All right. So there was an app where you could poke someone on Facebook. So let's use the example of the poke. I poke you, Hemma, right? And there's data that says, I poked you, and then you respond. You might poke me back. So that we have this closed loop of this interaction. I do this behavior to you, and you reciprocate, right? So we can see that in the data analytics. But I might poke you, and then you go, ooh, I could poke, and you might poke 3 other people.
Right.
And those 3 other people might poke 3 other people. And then all of a sudden we could see this data, this behavior propagate through the social network, because I can see my connection to your connection, to your connections, to their connections, and so on. It was the first time you could see virality of a behavior and actually see the data. All right. Now, we know that viral behavior happens in real life, but we had no way to capture it, capture the data, observe the phenomenon in some quantifiable way, see where it got blocked, see how it changed, and so on. So this was brand new. This was actually revolutionary. And so BJ stepped back and said, wow, we have entered the era of mass interpersonal persuasion, where if you write an app and you put it in a social network, it will propagate through that network. And we can see all these people engage in that behavior.
Right.
Wow. And he's thinking, if we can do this, now we're treating behavior generically. We're not putting a moral value on the behavior. It could be good behaviors. It could be bad behaviors. It could be all sorts of behaviors, which 15 years hence, we have seen how that has played out, mostly in the bad behaviors. But he said, oh, if we can do this, could we begin to perhaps take on a big challenge like world peace? Because BJ is an experimental behavioral psychologist. And he's going, maybe we have a tool to increase peace in the world.
Right.
And that's where the genesis of peace innovation came from, of saying, okay, we have technology, we have behavior, we have data, and we have a way to spark this behavior. So what kind of pro-social behaviors, positive peace behaviors, can we initiate through technology? Can we set off through technology? And then we can see if it's effective.
And that's a phenomenal question. I mean, that's the right question to be asking, right? At this moment where we know, back to what you said at the top, anything's possible and we can get behind it, right? Have the confidence, we can learn what we need to learn. But to design behavior that has positive, generative, pro-social outcomes, I mean, that's a question worth asking. So I know that's a question that you in the Peace Innovation Lab have been asking. What surprised you about this? What developments have you seen that have verified this theory that these techniques can be used for good?
Well, I think one of the big ahas early on in the lab was that we tend to be blind to the goodness in the world. Okay, so people will say we have heightened threat detection because we have to know when the bear is going to come and eat us, right?
Right.
Or when a predator is going to come and chase us down. So we have the fight, flight, freeze. We're very hyper vigilant toward any kind of threat, perceived or real, right? But we are not hyper vigilant to the good because that doesn't require a response from us. It doesn't require kinetic action from us. If something good is happening in the world, it doesn't mean that we have to all of a sudden start running in the opposite direction, right? If something good is happening in the world, we're just chill. We're just sitting there eating our berries, talking to our friends, braiding hair, doing whatever it is that Paleolithic people did. It doesn't require anything from us. So we are blind, utterly blind to all the goodness, all the kindness, all the positive acts in the world. We take them for granted.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're blind to it, we think that it doesn't exist. So one of the early projects that we did was Peace. And Facebook was one of our partners. And we said, okay, show us some peace data. And so we had to define it. And we said, okay, the unique new friendships that are created across a conflict boundary. So the number of unique new friendships between Israelis and Palestinians, between Russians and Ukrainians, between Turks and Greeks, we looked at all the different conflict boundaries around the world, and they had a daily number where you could see the new friendships, the net new friendships that day.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time where you could say, oh, okay, my perception is that these people are mortal enemies and they would never, ever, ever have any kind of positive relationship with each other. But we see in the data that they actually are friends. They're publicly digital friends. Now, we can't say anything about the quality of the friendship, but this was in 2009. But clearly there is enough of a connection for them to say, yes, we will be friends on Facebook. And so that was the first time we could begin to surface this positive data.
Mm-hmm.
The other reference point was looking at conflict data from eBay. So eBay, you have millions of transactions, and you say, how many of those buy-sell arrangements are positive, that they work out well? Turns out that 97% of the transactions were positive. And you would think, well, that's a lot of goodness. And the 3% that were left that didn't go well tended to be because of misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't because someone was trying to actively cheat you.
Correct.
Right? So when we look at like transactional, like e-commerce data, it is overwhelmingly positive.
Right.
Okay. So it turns out that for the most part, and Ken, you have data that for the most part, people want to have good interactions with other people. We looked at Jeff Lynne at League of Legends was looking at that platform and saying, "Oh gosh, this platform seems kind of toxic. I don't know what's going on. Should we do anything about it?" And then he determined, yes, let's figure out how to reduce the toxicity on the platform. And basically, they did like all the Psych 101 interventions that you can imagine. They experimented with user interface design. They experimented with the chat, the tribunals, this and that and the other. And because at first he said, well, I know what, we'll just get rid of all the assholes on the platform, all the guys who are just jerks. And then he realized that he couldn't do that because then they'd have to get rid of everyone.
Mm.
What it turned out was that statistically, if you were playing on this platform, somebody was having a bad day. It's not that this person was chronically bad. There's a small percentage that are.
Okay.
But for the most part, it was someone having a bad day or not being self-aware that they were being a jerk, that they were being hostile, and so on. And so they did simple things like, let me reflect back to you how you're coming off to other people. And then these guys would get, oh, I did that. They didn't have that level of self-awareness to do that.
Yeah.
Right. So we could see in these various experiments that if you can reflect back to people, they can check their behavior. Now, there's a ton of bad behavior on the web. I don't know what percentage of that is bot-based, because we have so much noise between human behavior and bot behavior. And of course, we know that there are bad actors out there that want to create this climate or perception of negativity and threat and so on. So there's a lot of manipulation going on right now, a lot of psychological operations going on all the platforms. And, there are some efforts to combat it, but I don't think it's being really addressed as this is PSYOP from other countries.
Right.
This is PSYOP from bad actors.
Mm-hmm.
Call it what it is. It's a national threat. And I have not seen any dialogue, at least in the public discourse, where people are aware of that. But I digress. So The point is that because of technology, we have all this data and we can actually see human behavior at scale, and we can see how you can trigger behavior in an intentional way. And that's what persuasive technology is all about, is how technology changes behavior at scale. So for us in the peace tech, peace innovation world, we're actively looking to work with creators, innovators, entrepreneurs, so that they are intentional about the behavior that they're going to elicit in the people who use their technology. And think about it and go, again, leading from the future, you want people to engage in your platform, your app, whatever. What is it that you want people to feel? What is it that you want people to do? How do you want them to show up in the world? Because your technology is going to directly influence that. Don't leave it to chance. And often I notice that developers aren't thinking that way. They're just thinking more in this very technical, very narrow way of if A, then B. And you go like, yeah, but what if, understand that this may be weaponized, or understand that people might use this as a tool to harm people. Have you put a safeguard around that? And for some reason in Silicon Valley, the culture is resistant to it. Imagine, if you will, that, you are Black & Decker. They make tools. And you're selling an electric saw, right? And someone said, every time someone uses your electric saw, their fingers get cut off. And you should really put some sort of a safety measure so when people use the tool, they don't lose their fingers, and that way they can continue to use your tool, right? Every other industry puts safety measures in place, going like, oh my gosh, yeah, if you do that, like McDonald's, you cannot make the coffee so hot that it creates third-degree burns, right? They go like, okay, yeah, obviously we don't want to do that. Let's fix it. We don't have the equivalent mindset in the Valley of saying we don't want to prevent third-degree burns by the use of our products.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking of the case you're talking about. So, safety when it comes to the Black & Decker tools or the burn from the McDonald's. I think the consciousness around that's come from litigation. I'm a lawyer myself. I wonder if it's the litigation piece, and we haven't quite cracked that there. Because I am interested in why there's pushback. We're obviously in the advent of disruptive technology, AI, LLMs. We're thinking about responsible tech right now. What does responsible AI look like? But it's interesting to see if there's a disconnect between those of us in my position that are an ethics and compliance professional that's trying to have things that are ethical by design, or right, to your point, positive peace by design. I love that you're thinking in that way. But if there's pushback, what's going to be the thing that changes that? Is it litigation and high fees, or could we find another way, right, to your point, where we learn the lesson from the health and safety or the aviation or the burns?
I think it's a really challenging question right now, because when you look at the behavior of Facebook, for instance, and Arturo Bejar was the head of safety there for many years, and he did a lot of compassion research there for years, and they would do the compassion research day, and it was great to learn all the stuff that they did. He left after a couple of years, and then he returned because he was looking at the issues with Instagram. And the social harm that was being done to adolescent girls, suicidal ideation, et cetera, right? Because of the platform. And he went back to Mark Zuckerberg and says, I want to work on this problem. I really want to solve this problem. And he went back as a consultant, and then he left because he realized Facebook had no intention of fixing the problem. So for what happens with these companies, and this is the tragedy of late stage capitalism, is that they are so profitable that whatever fine that you have is just part of the cost of doing business for them. They go, oh, you're going to fine us $500 million. No big deal. We just made, how many billions and trillions last year. That's a rounding error. So for them, it's just the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
And also because of the way these technology companies have been set up, they say we're a platform, we're just a pipe, we're not responsible for the content. So they've done the workarounds that, like, say, traditional media, in terms of the rules and regulatory environment of traditional media, doesn't apply to these platforms.
Right. I know there's litigation in Texas that's trying to challenge that, but yes, you're right. That's a debate to be had. It's confusing though, because you're right. I understand the fine might not be enough and it might not be a deterrent. But maybe it's back to your explanation of positive peace. The way that we're approaching it as police and enforcers is what's getting in the way, right? Because the cost of responsible innovation isn't that high either, right?
No, not at all. So here's the dilemma with a platform like Facebook. We get these exponential growth, right, in terms of users and transactions and so on. And the way we respond is linear, right? So if you look at the exponential math, initially, the curve looks flat, or it might look like a line. And so you don't really see the threat. It's sort of like with COVID, and we were trying to figure out what the R number was. Like, okay, how quickly is this spreading? Well, it doesn't look like a big deal. And then like one day it just spikes, right? And you go, oh, crap. How are we going to? And so you have this delta, this gap between your ability to respond and the rate at which the problem is growing.
Right.
Okay. And so once that number, you get that spread, the amount of effort that you need to do to close that gap is exponential. The cost is exponential. And they're going like, and this isn't to say that Facebook doesn't throw resources at this, because they do have content moderators. And the poor guy who's head of AI there, the New York Times did a profile on him years ago, and he's going like, God, I didn't know I was signed up to screen out horrific content, and it was depressing, and it was affecting his mental health, right? So the problem is that once that number gets to a certain scale, there's no amount of effort that you can do to close it,
right?
Because the math just isn't math,
right?
And that's the problem with these
responsible design. That ship has sailed in some of these places, right? It's not like we're starting again from scratch.
Right. So that's why I advocate that you have to design this to be ethical and safe from the very beginning.
Yes, that's right.
So that way you don't have that gap. And then you can start closing those doors of ability for people to abuse the platform. You do it proactively from the very beginning.
Right.
And you're conditioning people in terms of, this is a narrow behavior that I'm going to allow you to do. Full stop.
Right.
This is all you can do. A, B, or C. That's it. And that way you mitigate that. But if you're trying to do it well after the fact, I don't think that's mathematically possible to fix.
That's depressing.
But that's the data, right?
Yeah, no, I got you. No. Oh gosh, there's so much there. I know there's so much we could talk about. There's two things I really want to make sure we cover. So one is, it's not really a tangent. It may be a very similar conversation, but climate action and sustainability, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you this in this way. Is the gap too big there as well? Like, what have you been doing in this space, and what are your views on the gap there?
Okay, it's really interesting. So the armchair climate experts on X and Twitter will tell you, we need to control the population. It's just way too many people. But when you look at the data and you look at the modeling, if you'd use tools like Climate Fresk, right? And it was a really interesting, I think it was Climate Fresk, or there's Climate Fresk and 2 Tons. And those are the two educational climate modeling tools that you can play with. And one of them gives you a dashboard, and you can slide things around. Okay, imagine that we go to all electric transportation. How does that change the CO2? And you see the line bend. What if we do this? And you know what? If you change the population, it does not bend the CO2, because most of the CO2 being produced is in the developed world. All right. And the United States. And historically, this has been the case where the United States, even though it's, 25% of the world's population, say, it uses 50% of the resources. These numbers are not accurate, so please don't troll me on this. But as a proportion, the United States doesn't represent a big part of the world, but we use an enormous amount of resources. So the behavior that actually has to change has to be in the United States. South America could do everything perfectly, and it would not change the needle. Africa could do everything perfectly, and it might change the needle a little bit because they have 1 billion people. But the United States we just consume so much. And again, we don't have that level of self-awareness about how much we consume and how much we waste. For Americans, I would say, if you have an opportunity to travel outside of the country, do so and spend some time. And I know it's a luxury to do that, but figure out a way to do that, because it will be eye-opening.
Mm-hmm.
It's as simple as when I lived in the Netherlands, how little trash I had. Because it's not a consumer society. You're not buying things from Costco and in boxes and in Amazon and this and that and the other. A lot of societies are much more oriented around experiences rather than buying stuff because they don't have the disposable income or the space to buy stuff. A Dutch home has no place to put a Costco-sized packet of toilet paper.
That's right.
There is no closet big enough to put that. There's literally no place to put it, right? Or when I'm in Mexico, the amount of trash that people have is tiny. It's a little bag. So then you go, oh gosh, you notice those things. When I'm in Argentina and they give you a cup of coffee and a coffee break at a university, it's a 4-ounce cup of coffee. It's tiny. The size of the napkins are tiny. In the United States, everything is big. But because that's our normal, we just assume that everybody else has that size of product as well, and they don't. So that's one thing. So the behavior that really needs to change is in the developed world, in the United States, Europe, the rest of the world, they don't consume a lot. And if you ask them to be more efficient, they're going like, we can't cut it anymore because we don't have a lot to begin with.
In my day job, as a corporate ethics and compliance officer in these big corporations. And my motivation in that role is to make sure we've got ethical behaviors at scale in our culture. Now, a lot of what you said, I think, is very exciting here because one is, are we focusing on the positive behaviors or the negative behaviors? If we're focusing on the negative behaviors and trying to police them, we might be getting in our way, number one. Number two is, can we use behavior design to get the behaviors we say we desire? And actually learn from the desirable behaviors what works and how can we take
Absolutely.
that and use it for the ones that are undesirable. Because again, if I remember correctly, what I've learned from BJ Fogg's work is you can not only design positive behaviors, but you can undesign the negative ones, make the negative ones harder to do so.
Absolutely.
So bring that up and ask you your thoughts on, the corporate culture environment and what we can do there.
Absolutely. So one thing that you need to lean into is that people are inherently lazy.
Yes.
Okay. So you can do, and the great thing about the Fogg model for behavior. So to recap, the Fogg behavior model is the behavior is comprised of 3 elements: motivation, ability, and a prompt. And the prompt would be like a trigger or call to action. So we know all about motivation. And motivation is a very weak lever to use because motivation's like the weather. Some days it's sunny, some days it's not. Sometimes you feel like it, some days you don't. So if you're relying on motivation, it's very unreliable. And often in organizations, leaders will say, what I need to do is motivate people, or we need to motivate the public, or things like that. But motivation is ephemeral. This isn't to say that it can't be useful. There are certain times where motivation is really key. We refer to them as motivation waves. So January 1st is a motivation wave. People go like, it's the new year. I'm going to do things different. So there's a surge in motivation. Or there might be some annual thing where you go, oh, I need to get focused on this because I'm very motivated. I need to sign up for this because there's a deadline, right?
Right.
Things like that. Christmas. Whoa, I'm motivated to get all my Christmas stuff done because I got a deadline. I think motivation deadlines are really good for all the ADHD kids, right? Because nothing motivates an ADHD kid like a deadline. You go, oh my God, I got to pull an all-nighter. And next thing you know, you folded all your laundry, you wash the dishes.
That's how I get everything done, Margarita.
You get everything done, right? Yes. So deadlines can be very, very good. And sometimes I wonder in the population if we have many more ADHD people than we realize. Because
you're probably more neurotypical to be ADHD, exactly.
Right. So that, but it's wavy. But the thing that people don't understand is ability. And there's 6 elements to ability. So one is, how much do you have to think? Brain cycles. Physical, how physical it is, how much physical work is this going to require on my part? Time, money. Is it socially deviant? Like, am I doing something that is outside of what my tribe would do? And then the other one, is it non-routine? Right? So those are like the 6 variables. And then, of course, the prompt, like the do it now. A lot of behavior doesn't happen because people aren't prompted to do it. So there's like the psychic network, like, you should read my mind that I wanted you to do this. Well, you have to say it. So fix the prompt. If you're still not getting it, then look at ability. And you have those 6 variables and you can play around with it. And all of them are elastic. So I look at like television viewing habits. Now, I'm old enough that I remember that you had to get up and actually change the channel on the television. And so for my dad, his children were the remote control.
Right.
He was too lazy to get up and change the channel and go, Mija, change the channel. So I go up and change the channel. And then you get a remote, right? And then we have cable and you're scrolling through and you're saying like, oh gosh, what am I going to watch? And I have to figure that out. And then we get Netflix. And Netflix has changed our consumption behavior. If I said to you, Hemma, let's go watch an 8-hour movie this weekend.
I think
Let's
you're
go
crazy.
watch an 8-hour movie. And you go like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't sit through an 8-hour movie. And I say, Hemma, let's binge watch Emily in Paris, right?
And we watch it. I'm with you the whole weekend.
we consume the whole thing, right?
Oh, that is how I watched Emily in Paris. Exactly how that went.
Right?
Yes.
You ate the whole thing. Now, if someone said to you, Hemma, are you going to sit in front of the television for 8 hours? You go like, no, I don't. I have so much to do. But what Netflix does is you do it, and they remove the friction.
That's right.
Of queuing it up. That 17 seconds later, the next episode's going to come up. So you don't even have to decide. It decides for you. It's making the assumptive close that you want to see the next episode. And then you have to actively opt out.
That's right.
And then we keep serving it up until it's done, right? And so it's removed the obstacle of you thinking about, do I want to watch this or not? Right? It's removed the physical obstacle of like, am I going to actually actively look for something else on my remote?
Right.
It's collapsed time because it doesn't give you a chance to think about like, oh, do I have the time? Right? All those things, it just removed the friction points. The opposite is true. If you want to make something harder for people to do, if you want to discourage them, then you play with those levers and you say, well, okay, instead of Netflix being $7.99 a month, I'm going to make it $20 a month. And then people go like, $20 a month? I might cancel my Netflix subscription. So you could manipulate money. And it doesn't have to be an astronomical amount. It could just be just out of reach where people go like, oh my God, Starbucks is now $7. Now, $7 in the whole scheme of things is not a lot of money. But you go, $7 for a drink? That's crazy. I'll pay $4 for a drink, but $7, that's crazy, right? So these are the things that you can play with. So you don't have to ban something.
Mm-hmm.
You can just make it just slightly out of reach, physically, economically. It might take too many steps. You see this in financial services in terms of, do you want to manipulate whether or not people save, whether or not people buy something on credit? I noticed this during COVID, where all of a sudden a firm came on the scene for e-commerce. You're like, oh, well, this thing that you want to buy is like $80, or you can pay for it for $20 a month.
That's right.
You go, oh, right? And so then you're changing that. So these are all ways to make it easier or make it harder for people to do something. And those are powerful tools. And you can use them in sustainability. You can use them in all sorts of areas.
Right. And I think it's really important to recognize where it is being used, where we are naturally using it, even as ethics and compliance professionals. Obviously, we have motivation by way of policies and threats. We have friction by way of process and lengthy checkboxes and forms. But to your point, if we want to influence behavior, the science will help us, right? We have to think about how we can do that. And back to the theme, to do it at scale, we're going to be leveraging technology thoughtfully in order to do it. So yeah, very exciting times. And I'm really grateful to you for sharing your insights. There's so much here. I think we're going to have you back, Margarita, because we could cover each of these topics for a separate episode. But really excited to hear about peace innovation. Really excited to hear about how you're leveraging behavior design in peace innovation, and also just how we're thinking about making sure we bring the female gaze.
Yeah, I do want to make one last point when we talk about peace and positive peace. So, often people think about peace, and we see this over and over again, where they say, "Oh, so let's proceed to talk for the next hour about war and conflict and violence reduction and things like that." That is talking about war and conflict. That's not talking about peace. Peace is a different state, right? And so, again, in terms of this leading from the future, if we want to live in peace, let's talk about it in very rich detail. What does that state of peace look like? What does it feel like? And this is like when you ask people, what do you want? And then they proceed to tell you all the things that they don't want. Right. And you go, okay, you've given me a litany of what you don't want, but I still don't have a spec of what you do want.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in order for us to build the future that we want to live in, whether it's peaceful or sustainable or otherwise, we need to be imagine that you're having a conversation with ChatGPT and you have to give it this prompt and you have to provide context for the prompt. And you say, I want to create a peaceful world. And it's going like, fantastic. What do you mean? What do you want? And so you say, okay, so in this world that we're going to create, and I want you, ChatGPT, to give me, the roadmap for that. I want to wake up and I want to have this much money in my bank account. I want my children to be happy and thriving in these ways, that my child goes to school and they walk to school happily with their friends and it's a beautiful day and it's a tree-lined street and there's not a lot of traffic. And when the cars drive by, they're driving by very respectfully at 25 miles per hour and all the detail and the context. And then the AI can say, oh, okay, so this is how we're going to get there. Right. Yeah. And so the same thing with positive peace. If we say to the ChatGPT, okay, so I don't want a school shooting and I don't want this and I don't want that. And it's going like, okay, that's like a negative space, but I have a blank canvas.
Yes.
I have removed these things. I'm excluding I'm not going to put it in the picture, but what's in the picture?
Right.
Right. So whether it's positive peace or positive behavior or everything like that, do think in detail about what it looks like, what it feels like, in as much human picture as possible. Right. Because when we dwell on the negative, if we have another peace conference and we talk about conflict, and then we have to have these defense weapons and all of this, we're just feeding the wolf of conflict.
Correct.
And that's a completely different design space. Now, this is not to say that there isn't a legitimate discussion about defense, but defense is very different from thriving.
Correct. We need to design thriving. Yeah.
Right. It's like when you go to a doctor and you say, I want to go to a doctor that's going to help me with wellness. I want to be thriving as a human. I would not go to a cardiologist. A cardiologist is dealing with an acute condition. You've just had a heart attack. And I have to help you with that heart attack. But what that doctor is going to do isn't going to necessarily create the conditions for you to thrive.
That's right. Margarita, there's so many things here. I know at the beginning of the call, you said what your vision was for our listeners at the end of the call. I'm going to summarize some of the things I've learned from you. One is to remember the survivor brain, right? What you've just been saying is the survivor brain has a role in making us look at the negative and making us think about fear. But if we sit in grace and gratitude for what actually works, if we remember there is peace as well as war, and then we use that as even the starting point for a picture of more peace, that might be the blank canvas, I think you said, for us to design for peace. So that's very profound but also very practical, right? It's like, yes, we all have a survivor brain, but we also have a capacity to notice what's working. I loved what you said about oftentimes things that go wrong are a confusion. There might be a few that are bad actors, but sometimes Absolutely. Just confusion or lack of self-awareness that can be very kindly and compassionately pointed out. And that in itself will cause peace. Just the compassion, the empathy, the kindness of pointing something out in a nice way can avert big problems. So focusing on the few bad actors and treating everyone as if they're bad actors can be a problem, but actually having this blank canvas can be really positive. So those are a couple of practical things I've taken from you. And just the fact that we've got power within us, holistic power, to design for peace. Again, I think that's very accessible, quite frankly.
I think we are all deserving of peace.
Yes.
Peace is not something utopian. It is not a naive aspiration. We are all deserving of living in grace, of living in kindness, and living in gratitude, and living in social interactions that help us thrive and that elevate us and that elevate others.
Right.
That is not unrealistic at all. In fact, I think that's our birthright.
It's our birthright and it's our power, I think I'm hearing as well.
Yes.
We've all got
Yes.
to do that.
So we shouldn't be ashamed of wanting peace in the world. I don't think it's a naive aspiration. I don't think it's something to be embarrassed about. In fact, I think it's something I want to give people permission to have peace in their lives. You are entitled to have peace. That should be the default.
That's right. And it doesn't need to be an audacious goal. Just going back to what you said at the top of the call, you have confidence in yourself that things are possible if you just roll up your sleeves, make the effort and find a way. And I hope our listeners feel the same after listening to you, that they also, just with confidence and the belief that they can make strides when it comes to peace, can follow in your footsteps. So thank you, Margarita, for being a shining example to all of us. Again, I hope we will hear from you again, because there's so much more to learn, but this has been a real lesson for me, a real masterclass in what I'm capable of doing as an individual towards peace. So thank you.
Thank you.